thank you all for coming, especially at 5 o'clock on the first day of the conference, which I know has been a long day for a lot of people. I just want to take a little bit of time today to share some thoughts that I've been mulling over as I've been privileged to be serving as president of APLS in thinking about issues related to science and justice, and social justice in particular. In part, this was sparked certainly by thinking about our location here in Atlanta, which, as we've heard from a couple of different people, is an important place for thinking about social justice and civil rights. Although our main considerations for finding a conference is often logistics and all that kind of stuff we were talking about in the EC today, I noticed an interesting confluence of history and culture that was difficult to ignore and got me thinking more about this topic, engaging science and engaging justice. Here in Atlanta, home to obviously Dr. Martin Luther King's National Historic Site, so many important events in the civil rights movement, also home to the Carter Center dedicated to health and peace. Also, for those of us who share training, particularly in community psychology, thank you, Dick, you probably could not have made it through graduate school without reading this article, Martin Luther King's address at the 1967 APA Annual Convention, which we are almost now at the 50-year anniversary of that, if I can have the privilege of rounding up a year or two here. Our plenary speakers for this conference feature a lawyer, activist, journalist that we heard from Amy Bach this morning, a researcher, Sarah Cook-Tomorrow, and lawyer Stephen Bright. Sarah and Stephen are both located here in Atlanta, and all three of those folks are using their skills to create social change, promote social justice for underserved populations. If you haven't read this address, I encourage you to do so. It's interesting to read about the issues that 50 years ago he was suggesting that behavioral scientists needed to investigate in order to help inform and transform the civil rights movement. I'm not going to go into the content of those. Sadly, some of them are still quite relevant today, 50 years later. But aside from the substance of his recommendation, I have taken away 2 points. One, his declaration that there is a role for the behavioral scientist in the civil rights movement. And 2, that he actually provided a list of things that would be most useful from his perspective for him and the civil rights movement, the front lines of social change that we as behavioral scientists could provide if we just listened. I added that part, he didn't say that. So I wanted to then start thinking about our society and how we engage with justice. My first thought was, of course, well, duh, we engage with justice. We're the Psychology Law Society. But then I began thinking a little bit more about it beyond that and started with the mission statement of our organization, which is up on our website in case you haven't been there and haven't seen it. To enhance well-being, justice, and human rights through the science and practice of psychology in legal contexts. Following that is a list of our values. And as a community psychologist, we are explicit about our values, so I must admit I was a little surprised and pleased to notice that as psychology law folks, in part as a function of the excellent strategic planning initiative under Brian Cutler's leadership several years ago, that we also declare values that guide our work. So with this mission and with these values, I still return to the question of what do we mean by social justice? Can we move past the we know it when we see it idea and all agree on what it is to really question what we mean by social justice and how we enact the value of social justice in our work as individuals and as an organization. So I'm going to focus on social justice in this, this fourth value in this list of values that we have here. So of course I went to Wikipedia first to think about the definition of social justice, but then also to the dictionary as well, which was a little bit less than helpful. Social justice as a term has historical usage and grounding in Catholic social theory, particularly among the Jesuits, which is relevant for me coming from Georgetown University, a Jesuit institution, and I'm a research fellow at our Center for Social Justice Research, Teaching, and Service. We talk there about the guiding framework of social justice as the personal obligation and right of each of us, based on our talents and gifts, to make a contribution to the common good, which seemed a little more helpful than Wikipedia and Merriam-Webster. But this focus on engaging justice as an organization came into sharp relief for me from my experiences on literally my first day as APLS president. I received the metaphorical gavel of APLS leadership from Patty Zapf at our executive committee meeting at the August 2015 APA convention. Literally, as our stalwart APA council reps at the time, Brian Cutler and David DiMatteo, discussed the Hoffman Report on APA and interrogation during a marathon council session, or as they described it later, a discussion about how we were going to discuss the report. And I continue to be grateful to them because of the important role they played in that discussion about discussing, emphasizing the role that rigorous ethical empirical research can play in improving law enforcement and military practices. Before that EC meeting, I'd emailed a small number of APLS members who I knew were involved and directly engaged in interrogation-related research for their reactions to the Hoffman Report, and then invited comments from the entire APLS membership. And I certainly thank folks who responded and encourage your continued input and following of this as it goes forward. But I just want to highlight a couple of interesting aspects of my communication with our members. First, the smaller circle of interrogation researchers and practitioners that I spoke with was somewhat divided about whether and how our division should engage with this issue and with APA about this report. The majority felt strongly that APLS should make some type of statement about interrogation research and practice, but others felt that we should not interject into what they described as an APA problem, not an APLS problem. Second, I heard from about 10 people in response to my division-wide email, each appreciating the opportunity to directly share their views. Interestingly, a sizable number of them didn't realize that one could be a member of APLS and not APA, or they'd allow their membership to lapse and so forth, and they were curious about how to rejoin. Several expressed surprise that I actually wrote back to their email with suggestions and connections to APLS resources. But finally, I realized that our organization, at least how it is described and the mechanisms we have in place, that we don't really have an established mechanism for discussing time-sensitive issues, developing an organizational response if we desired to have one, and engaging at the organizational level in larger conversations among researchers, policymakers, practitioners, and the public. We all do that in various ways individually, and we have a great white paper project which has produced thoughtful and comprehensive research reviews and empirically based recommendations for law and policy, but that process and those products are deliberately and intentionally slow and deliberate. Two words that rarely describe pressing social issues. I know that our past president, Patty Zapf's initiative on improving internal and external communications will make great strides in enabling a wider conversation among our membership. And indeed, our improved website, thank you, Kento, and the committee provided one way to inform APLS members, especially those who are not also APA members, about the Hoffman Report. Yet, I left those discussions and those realizations feeling that there was a risk for us to be left out of a conversation and a decision that potentially had profound impact on the work that we do as researchers and the capacity for our work to do good and to serve social justice. Which then led me to the question, how effective are we as an organization at valuing and creating social justice? We have the mission statement, values, strategies, and goals, and so forth, and I know that effort involved a large number of you in groups tasked with sussing out these different components of the strategic plan. Like a number, but not all divisions within APA, we have these components up on our website for all to see. But the question now remains for me, have we been successful? What are our short and long-term goals as an organization? Have we met them? And if not, what are our levers for change? So one way to start answering this question, this is a giant conversation inside my head in case you couldn't know as this is going forward. One way, I said to myself, would be to examine where we've been. What is our history? And this is something that actually just came home to me about 2 hours ago this afternoon in the great panel on leadership that was sponsored by a number of our different committees working together, including the Professional Development of Women Committee. And I realized if one had joined APLS within the last 5 years, you've seen terrific leadership by a series of women who have successfully helmed APLS as an organization, as the editor of our journal, as committee chairs, and so forth. But I know that it wasn't always that way. And I know that a number of women exerted leadership when it wasn't so easy to do so. This made me realize that we need to know our history. In a very small way, this reminds me of the discussion, I hesitate to bring it up, in the presidential campaign, of the different waves of feminism that the Clinton campaign has engendered. I don't want to travel down that road today, but I do want for us to acknowledge and remember our history as we go forward. Other divisions have committees or projects for both oral and written histories, and I believe there may have been some efforts to do so in APLS, but I'll be thinking more about how we might accomplish that in the future. In addition to thinking about our history, one way to think about whether we're effective at social justice is also to examine our organizational structure. How do we do what we say that we do? How are we set up to examine the ways we can tackle the issues of social justice and engage in issues of policy and practice that might relate to justice? I did a cursory examination of each of APA's divisions' website, which was really interesting, to examine their structure and how they each claim and enact our value of social justice, diversity, and inclusion. Many, if not most, have committees or positions focused on diversity, although it's not entirely clear what those committees do. Of course, here we have a terrifically strong Minority Affairs Committee and Professional Development of Women Committee that engage a variety of initiatives to promote diversity and inclusion. But I was really interested in seeing how folks engaged this issue of social justice, right? This thing that we all kind of nod our head and agree on. While it's difficult to determine exactly what divisions do, and as dedicated as I was to finding this out, I was not willing to read through the executive committee minutes for each of the 40-some-odd divisions that were there. But some did stand out for their structural mechanisms that might facilitate a divisional consideration of and a response to social justice issues. So if I can make this go next. And so this is just a quick summary of some of the different kinds of ways and mechanisms that other divisions have for engaging issues of policy and justice. I'm not sure whether APLS should or could develop some additional type of mechanism that focuses on policy issues. The mission statements for these committees vary substantially. I've been involved with the public policy committees in one or two of these other divisions, and their activities vary widely as well. And honestly, some, which I belong to but shall remain nameless, I personally believe are a little too quick to offer policy statements on some issues that, while consistent with their values as an organization, might not be well grounded in scientific evidence. Or that's not to say that the policy positions contradicted the science, but just that there wasn't a whole lot of science there on which to base those positions. So certainly there are a wide range of things to think about, and this is one of the discussions that I hope we can continue to have as a membership and as an EC. Is there a need for a mechanism that we could be responsive to issues, not just like the APA issue I was talking about, but to larger policy conversations that might not move on the slower, more deliberate pace of our white paper? We've always been in conversation with the world about our research, individually and collectively. So that's why I turn to next to think about these issues of social justice. And I decided to look at our primary way of conveying science to the world, what we publish. There's many different ways to think about and understand what we publish. And inspired by an article in the Journal of Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology, I will admit this is the first time I ever read anything in that journal, entitled Social Justice in Psychology, What Is and What Should Be, there was one little piece that was not so theoretical or philosophical that I could understand, where they searched PsycNet in 2012 for the term justice and found more than 38,000 items, or about 1% of the database referring to justice. So I did a replication and extension of that work by putting the term social justice into PsycInfo to see what I could find. It's actual a keyword in the system. And it produced about 4,800 articles. Interestingly, about 500 of those were dissertations. Combining the words law or legal with social justice produces 274 hits. So I won't go down the rabbit hole of describing all of those. And we certainly have publications and books and so forth that come from our members that talk about social justice, conflict, well-being, and so forth. I wanted, though, to examine what we publish in a slightly more comprehensive and different way. rather than starting with the term social justice and asking, what do we do? I wanted to start with what we publish. Social justice fits in with all the other topics and ideas. So for those of you that know me, you know that I'm a technology and a data geek, even if I can't use all of it well. And there just happened to be some new software that emerged a couple of months ago for constructing and visualizing bibliometric networks, right? For understanding and being able to classify and visualize keywords and text mining that occurs in journals. It can connect researchers, it can connect publications, and all these different things. So it offers this possibility of visualizing the keywords that are used in journal articles. And so I downloaded from Web of Science all of our LHB articles in our history and plugged them into this software. I'm not going to go into the algorithm that they use, although I can if you want to later. But it produces, and I'm going to do that horrible presentation thing. I know you can't see this, but I'll do it anyway, right? And it produces through this algorithm, right, taking the most commonly used words, meaningful words, like introduction was one of the top ones, but I kicked that out. Some of the most commonly used words, and then clusters them as well to begin to get a sense of kind of what it is that we're talking about and what we're publishing. So in the green, my qualitative interpretation, we see words like offender, psychopathy, recidivism, mental illness, and so forth. Here in the yellow, issues related to youth and competence and Miranda. And Tom, I think actually your last name comes up as a keyword in this as well. I was like, I know him. Right. This whole blue section talking about eyewitness, right, and accuracy, identification, lineups, and so forth. And up here, jurors, expert testimony, condition, deliberation, all these kinds of things. But I thought this gives us kind of an interesting view, right, of the clusters. Here's a cool heat density map that does the same thing, that really just pulls out a little bit more what some of the keywords are. I don't think you made this map, Tom, I'm sorry to say. But beginning to get a sense, right, just from this one journal where we publish, of the kinds of ideas and keywords that we talk about. I know that's not the only place where we published. So I also just took several of the other law-related journals, or journals that had the names psychology and law in them, and did the same thing. So also psychology, public policy and law, behavioral sciences and the law, psychology, crime and law, and did the same thing with the same kinds of terms. And really, I think, produced somewhat similar kinds of results. So even combining across those journals, we see similar clusters of the topics that we're focusing on and what it is that we're doing. So those visualizations probably aren't a surprise to anyone. And we have important work that's being published and generated on these topics. But with these keyword lists and maps as a starting point, I searched for social justice or anything kind of related to that topic, and I couldn't find any. And I know that these journals are a significant but limited collection of outlets for work for Division 41 members. We have a much wider reach. And I also realized there's no real way to figure that out either from the information we have about ourselves and others. So I decided with limited data, I'm free to just speculate here and make stuff up. So I wanted to highlight just a couple of areas or focal points that I wanted to encourage us as an organization, and myself really, to consider directing our attention, our resources, and our brain trust to. One of those is thinking about the justice system as a system itself. When I was looking through all those keywords, and again, I get all the limitations of them, what was difficult to find was the bigger picture about the system and the people who are in that system as people. So I want to make just two, I think, deceptively simple points about what we study and how we study it. I'd like to encourage us to study the justice system as a system, or a set of systems at the system level. And second, I want to argue that we need to better understand, respect, and involve the individuals who are involved in that justice system in our own research. One important way to do that is through qualitative and mixed methods approaches, which in and of themselves can be viewed as a justice-oriented methodology, empowering methodology. Another way is to really focus on understanding systems as systems. place individuals in their larger context and the organizations with which they interact in a larger system context. Here's another slide to read, but the whole point actually of showing it is that you can't read it. This is just a map. I'm on the Board of Juvenile Justice for the state of Virginia, and this is just a quick map of what that process is for the one system, right, and the case flow that might go through it. But we know that the juvenile justice system, as an example, is actually a collection of many separate organizations with many different roles, including law enforcement, the prosecuting attorney, the defense attorney, the judiciary, probation, departments of youth services, and so forth. Donna Bishop and her colleagues talk about this a couple of times in a couple of different places. Each of these entities operates in a separate bureaucracy and is linked to other organizations through the flow of cases. A variety of decisions by these organizations determine whether a case proceeds or dumps out, right, is removed from further processing. So it can move from an intake officer who recommends to a prosecutor to dismiss or to divert or process informally or advance the case. They're usually part of a court services or a probation unit that tends to have a treatment and rehabilitation orientation and really prioritizes the needs of youth. The prosecuting attorney focuses on community safety and accountability, and it prioritizes those concerns over the best interest of the youth. That decision to advance the case is made solely by the prosecutor, whose goals of accountability and justice drive the process forward. And so I could go on, but I won't, about all of these different decisions that take place and the sequence of interactions that occur in this system. One of the things that I want to highlight, though, is that it almost doesn't matter who the individual person is in that, right? That we have these larger system level and organizational forces that are providing the context in which those decisions occur or can happen. And so for that reason, we really need to think about these interactions at a system level, not just at a case level. And there are certainly examples of folks who have talked about this already. One of the things I discovered is any idea I had, everybody already had before this, so I was just going to maybe reiterate and describe what folks have done already. Thinking about the interaction between the justice system and the mental health system, which I know many of you work in, and the great work that's been happening on mental health courts as a system-level intervention designing to change the way that those systems interact. Lois Whitehurn, certainly in her article on Troubled and Troublesome Youth, identified 5 sets of systems that she points out depending on how a youth who's acting out is initially responded to, which system is called first, could really drive the sense of that case and the response to that youth. And certainly the idea of the connection between child welfare and juvenile justice. So significant work is happening, I think, and this report comes from a colleague of mine, Shay Bilchik, at the Georgetown Center for Juvenile Justice Reform, which is really focused on system-level change and brings state-level teams in from all different systems within that state to try to identify a problem that's happening in the interaction between those systems and how to resolve it or how to address it. So there are different ways we can think about systems, and there are other literatures that are certainly doing this already. And I want to encourage us to think about the possibility that we might be able to do some of this work as well and to bring our expertise on the legal system and how these things work to understanding. Much of that work is focused more on human service delivery systems, right? But helps us understand that there are pathways through these systems that could be the target of intervention. That there are institutional structures like laws, resource allegations, culture, norms, and so forth that can be elements of system change. More effective processing through the system or more effective collaboration between those systems, right, can increase the capacity of those systems to serve youth in a just way, can also create institutional structures that allow those systems changes to happen. But of course, I didn't think of any of this, right? So if we go back to an article by Kelitz and Ron Resch, now known as Rosh, right? Talked about this a number of years ago. How can we conceptualize the different levels of interactions between the mental health and the justice system? Which of these time they argued we were really focusing on, and which were we missing out on? And where were really the gaps in thinking about the interactions between those systems and how change could happen to promote more effective interaction? right? Of course, the thing is you have to really want to change in order for change to occur. But it's not clear that systems want to change for lots of different reasons. It's not clear that we want to change in terms of the kind of work we do or the kind of approach that we do. But I think there really are advantages to thinking about a systems approach to our research and to thinking about social justice. A systems approach is grounded in the reality of how systems actually work, not our perspective or our assumptions about how they work. They help us move to a focus beyond individuals and for us to understand settings and to think about settings and the influence of those settings on the kinds of outcomes that we are interested in at the individual level. And it also encourages us to think about what are called boundary spanners. That again, Hank Steadman wrote about in 1992. I certainly did not invent, but has also been in the organizational literature, right? This notion that there are people and connections between organizations that essentially allow translation and more effective connection between them, right? I've had the opportunity to be shaped by several boundary spanners in my professional experience, and now that I say that out loud, it sounds kind of weird. It didn't look weird when I wrote it. I've been shaped by boundary spanners, but some of whom all operated at the same time to shape my interest in thinking as I decided against law school and headed to graduate school. My first was in the Victim Witness Assistance Program in Albemarle County in Virginia in the late 1980s. We were early in the victim movement. We were after the Victims of Crime Act, the VOCA Act, but before the Violence Against Women Act of '94. And our program, the Victim Witness Assistance Program, was one of the few and perhaps the only one in Virginia to be located in a police department, not in a Commonwealth's attorney's office, our version of the state prosecutor's office. It was a one-woman office with my part-time assistant, so I guess it was a woman and a half office at that point. And when it really came down to it, our job was boundary spanning. How did we connect the various offices within the justice system, and how do we connect health, economic assistance, and other systems to first even acknowledge victims and the importance of their role and who they were and what they'd experienced, and second, to support and assist them. So that was perhaps my first introduction to this notion of boundary spanning, and really pointed out for me the importance of thinking about these linkages and the people who create those linkages to produce social justice. And of course, I certainly had Dick Rapucci to help show me how academics could be engaged as boundary spanning partners with other organizations and agencies. His engagement with folks all over the state of Virginia was a good model for the engaged academic, and the importance of really trying to listen and understand how systems really worked, not just how we thought they worked. He introduced me to the other boundary spanner that shaped me, Harriet Russell, who got several of us graduate students involved in the Virginia Commission on Family Violence Prevention. It was an interagency commission created by Chief Justice Harry Carrico of the Virginia Supreme Court. And of course, as the saying goes, if it is a saying, when the Chief Justice calls, people actually answer the phone. And so folks showed up to the meeting from all the different systems in Virginia that touched the family violence issue in some way. And I was able to watch and learn as Harriet, who was trained as a nurse, actually, and negotiated these various systems connected to victims of family violence at a policy and a practice level several orders of magnitude higher than my experience in the Victim Witness Assistance Office trying to do that at the local level. She was the one who helped get different stakeholders to the table and to actually talk to each other. She was the person who didn't use the term boundary spanner, but offered the analogy of a bridge when thinking about how scientists were trying to bring empirical evidence to inform policy and practice. She described herself at one end of a bridge that led to the policy and practice world, and people like me were at the other end of that bridge, leading into the science world. And our job was to be able to communicate to each other, Harriet and me, on that bridge, right? And to communicate to each other what was happening in our respective worlds so we could understand it, and then translate back to our fellow scientists, policymakers, and so forth. And she was actually standing at the end of a lot of different bridges, which I realize now is kind of starting to fall apart as an analogy as I think of her standing on multiple bridges at the same time, but hopefully you get the point that you couldn't understand the cross-system challenges that existed as barriers to more effective responses to family violence victims in Virginia. Nor could you understand how the changes occurred that actually did occur as a function of that commission, okay, without understanding folks like Harriet. and without understanding the kinds of changes that she and others were able to create. And she was always the person who said to me, numbers can be great, but not p-values. Please take those out of your slides, Jen. Numbers can be great, but you always have to connect the numbers to a story. And sometimes numbers are the best vehicle for conveying the story or the lived experiences of folks who are actually living the phenomenon. We study family violence. They are living family violence. So that leads me just to my second suggestion, point, encouragement for us as a division is to consider broadening and expanding our approach to understanding justice and social justice by taking a qualitative methodological approach to that. The stories and the thick, deep description that can come from that inductive qualitative approach can capture things that our most sophisticated quantitative methodology can't. And we're trying to capture and understand things like this, right, which was the Washington Post headline from a couple of days ago. That I was trading on Facebook with a couple of friends and my sister, who's a legal advocate for kids. And I can't say out loud the words that we used to describe this particular headline and how we were thinking about it, right? But it suggested that there's more than surveys and broad quantitative work we need to do. We need to understand how these kinds of perspectives happen and what is needed in order to change those. So there's a variety of different qualitative methods, and I know some of you, perhaps many of you, use these methods, right? By our very nature almost, the work that we do is boundary spanning work, right? It's in the name of our association, Psychology and Law. You partner with government agencies, practitioners, folks from other disciplines to come together around these issues. For example, ethical, empirically informed interrogation practices, right? But one of the things that I think qualitative methods do better than quantitative methods is essentially giving voice, right, to the people and the experiences that we're studying. Here are the voices of the participants in our research. One other way to engage social justice is not only to think at a systems level about the work that we do, but to think about how our work can lift up the voices and perspectives of those that otherwise go unheard. STEIN and Minkowski in 2004 published an article that talked about this process that's involved in qualitative methods and described it in 4 acts here. I have the sense, and I know it's true for me, perhaps it's true for you, that some of these processes, right, the art of asking, the act of witnessing, the act of talking to individual stakeholders to learn about the area and the judge and so forth and the processes, are the things that happen so that we can get to the actual research that we're going to do, right? The more sophisticated design, the great experimental study, and so forth. We might be informed by these types of conversations, but they're usually often means to an end, as opposed to an end in and of themselves, and an important object for our research. Asking, talking with the people who are the focus of our inquiry, witnessing, listening to and affirming the experiences of research participants. They do point out that the 2 places where witnessing is used are in the practices of religion and law. So the word witness is not too far from the kind of work that we do. Interpreting, making sense of the collective experience of participants by transforming the stories, their participant stories, into research stories, right? Based on the experiences and the knowledge of the researcher. We have interpretive authority as researchers in working with this qualitative material. We're involved and engaged, which helps us with the act of knowing, right? Creating publicly accessible representations of this knowledge, creating the stories in a systematic research way, not a journalistic way. The stories that can augment the quantitative work so that when we describe the story or learn from those stakeholders, we can then also say, and these are not exceptions to the rule, right? Here's the quantitative research that undergirds and supports what we're learning from these individuals through these types of qualitative work. For whose benefit is the research being conducted, and what good can our work do for the people that we've come to know through our studies? Here's just one illustration of a study of parent engagement, a qualitative study of parent engagement in the justice system. Here's my 3rd slide. Hey, you can read this. But I started coming to GED classes here at school because it's close to home. Now I volunteer in the school. I used to be so shy, I didn't know what to say that would work, so I wouldn't come to school or talk to the principal or the teachers. These were kids that were coming through, right, the school to prison pipeline. For example, when other kids were picking on my son on the bus. Now I'm around. I know the kids, the teachers, and the principal, so if there's a problem, I can go to talk to any of them without yelling in a way that works for me because it gets me what I want. I see some parents who won't come in or who come in and yell, and either way they don't get what they want. Right? That is a deep, thick description of what's happening in this individual mother's life that I think augments and supplements and enhances the broader quantitative description that we could have of the school to prison pipeline or the engagement of parents or the problem of truancy in schools. Now, we have folks who are doing great qualitative work. As I searched for qualitative in our journals or using law and legal as keywords in PsycInfo, there is terrific work happening. It's just there aren't many that I could find, and they're not easily found. I'm sure there are more. Like I said, it's difficult. Our interdisciplinarity means that there's not one single place or one single keyword one can use to find all the different kinds of work that we're doing. So I'm sure there's more. I want to encourage that. There are certainly implications for training as well. I know I've had some conversations with Megan and other folks, right? Did you all find somebody to talk about qualitative methods yesterday? Who are searching, for example, for someone to do a pre-conference workshop on qualitative methods, and I couldn't come up with anyone to do it that would already be coming here. If you can, please let us know, and we'll think about you for next year, right? But certainly, qualitative methods is one of the things that in the graduate training survey, folks indicated they might be interested in, and a majority of folks really were not getting, I think, beyond case studies, which to me probably overlapped with forensic case study as opposed to some of the more qualitative case studies that I would be thinking of. Okay, so I want to just wrap up with talking about the importance of listening at a couple of different levels. The persons and the stories that we know from our research, right, are important components for our understanding of social injustice and social justice. It can't be, I think, just the numbers. So in reference to policy level change, for example, who works in policy has said, if you just take the science into account, you're dead in the water with that conversation, that we've got to have an informed approach to understanding and conveying the science as well as the study, as well as the story, and to understand the political and policy context into which we are bringing those numbers and those stories. So this issue of the importance of listening has come up several times, and I want to call us out a little bit here at the end, call myself out a little bit, on the ways that we think and talk about the folks in these various systems that we study. One of the topics we were talking about in the executive committee today is wanting to expand our connection with and the involvement, right, of a variety of practitioners and other kinds of folks in APLS. We have terrifically engaged practitioners and folks now, but how do we grow that, right? How do we move beyond our group? But we need to think about what kind of environment we've created for those folks as they enter our world into APLS, right? So for example, during one of the presentations at last year's conference, one of the speakers was talking about a conversation he was having with law enforcement and was describing his frustration about the lack of empirically informed practices that were happening in that law enforcement world. And he described this conversation and he said, so when a detective said, until you've investigated a few child homicides, right, you're not going to know how this really works. The audience, us, groaned, right, in sympathy, and the presenter said, now you see what we're working with, right? Now, there are always inside jokes and perspectives, and it's important for us to support each other and to understand the challenges that go. I heard that comment, I just dropped. I thought, I hope there's no one in the room that does that kind of work, because they certainly, I would think, not feel quite as welcome. And that's not the only time that that's happened, but I'm guilty of this as well. But I just want to remind myself and the rest of us that we have to listen to and understand the perspectives of that detective, that defendant, that prosecutor, and that judge. Prosecutors seem to get picked on a lot in our group. They do have things to teach us, and I know that we know that. And there were other examples in the same conference last year of researchers describing how they invested the time in the relationships and the conversations to learn from folks in the field, and how that paid off in terms of better relationships, better trust, and frankly, just better research that they produced. So my thoughts going forward are to think about social justice and to encourage all of us to think about it, social justice. What does it mean to us as an organization? How do we define it? And how do we conduct our research and interventions in ways that might expand our opportunities to partner with others to advance it? So thanks for listening.